Frances, I'm going to start with you if that's okay.
Sure.
So we've heard a little bit about the future of work this morning from both Andrew and from Tony talking about what they're doing. What do you think this means for leadership, future leadership skills and capability, and then how that plays into governance?
Okay. So first up, I think leadership is changing as we see it right now, where people are starting to understand that we have to equalise capability. You know, it's coming from all parts of the market. We're having to think about the skill sets of a generation coming through who think differently. We're having to think about the skills of our governance leaders, our executive teams, and how we can work together. But actually, when we think of capability, my fundamental concern right now in New Zealand is we have no idea how unskilled we already are. I think that if you look across into other markets, the people making decisions are so much more informed about what is needed, the type of capability. And I think part of it is driven by our very low unemployment rate. So I'm seeing organisations who are letting people go who perhaps don't have the right mindset to adopt and adapt to new ways of working. And instead of going out and traditionally taking that small amount of time to perhaps have a sabbatical, reskill, look at the skills they need for the next job, they're literally walking into another job the next day. And so there's no raising of capability of decision makers. So we're just basically shifting the same skill set around the whole ecosystem. And so unless we're injecting new skills and capability, I think I've got a real fear that we're going to plateau pretty soon. Because if you start looking out there for people who really understand systems across the ecosystem, if you think about people in just key areas between, you know, is it DevOps or whether it's people who understand usability and the customer and user experiences, there's such a dearth of knowledge. And then before we even start playing in the data world, where there's just not the programs out there or the adoption rate. And one of the stats that keeps being bandied around is just how low New Zealand is in the OECD in terms of upskilling. You know, we're right at the bottom of the pack. And I keep comparing ourselves to other small economies where productivity gains have been quite consistent, and we're starting to see innovation really playing out the strongest in small economies, and we're the outlier as a country. You know, we're not innovating. And so we do have this responsibility as leaders to say who in our organisation is ready and open to adoption of new ways of thinking. It could be the business structures, the working environment, the working model. It could be, you know, faster adoption of things like portfolio careers, but it could also be just bringing through talent and augmenting it constantly with new people. So big challenges.
Wow, that's a pretty alarming statistic around the employment stopping us from upskilling. Kirk, is that something that's tuning up in the conversations that you're having with the government? And when you think about those sorts of conversations, what would you encourage this audience to be doing in terms of how it starts to think about influencing policy?
I think I might just start by kind of talking about the 4 strands that the Future Work Forum is looking at, because it covers much of what has been talked about, as you would imagine. So just the 4 streams are just transitions, digital inclusion, lifelong learning and productivity, all the things that have been talked about already. But to Frances's point, I think probably one of the most and what Andrew said actually in his presentation, one of the most important components of all of those strands, and the one that brings it together the most is the concept of lifelong learning, because we just don't really have it here. We've got a very good education system for what has been an industrial economy. That's not going to serve us particularly well for the Industry 4.0. So I think for businesses that are thinking about this and how they might engage, it is bringing live scalable examples of how they have integrated lifelong learning into their workplace, and it's something that Tony's talked about already very well, because this isn't just about, if you stay true to this principle about making sure you look after your people, it's not just restructuring. The future will not be about restructuring people out. It cannot be about restructuring people out. There's too much cost involved with that, and you're not being true to looking after people. So thinking about the institutional features of lifelong learning and the component that the workplace plays in that is going to be super critical to our success.
That's really helpful actually. So there you go, people, focusing on helping lifelong learning inside your organisations. Rob, how's this turning up in the boardroom? You know, this is a really strategic long-term issue, and I think you and I have talked in the past about how how are directors starting to tackle these really long-term issues?
Well, the boardroom's a bit like the small brain of an elephant. You hit an elephant on the tail, and it takes a hell of a long time for the impulse to actually get to the elephant. So if you were looking for innovation, the boardroom would be the last place you would typically go. The future of work is being increasingly discussed at boards. I happen to think that boards think about the future of work as something that happens to other people. And these sorts of forums do tend to kind of have that flavour of this is something that's happening to others. In fact, of course, if you were serious about the future of work and technology, you could quickly disrupt the way boards work. You could stop all the time that firms spend doctoring and curating papers for the board. Most of what a board does today in terms of its compliance could readily be automated. In fact, it's amazing to me that nobody yet has invented and applied an algorithm that could in fact cover all of the compliance work of the board at the press of a button, drawing on the actual data within the business rather than curated data. So that's a small thing. You could get rid of that and then boards could focus. Of course, you'd have to change the boards because they're no good at thinking about anything beyond that, stuff that a machine can do. Sue's an honourable exception, just straight in front of me. And boards should then be could then focus on and skill themselves to focus on what are we doing and why are we doing it? How are we doing it and why are we doing it that way? And actually perform a useful function. So I'm in this camp that says automation and artificial intelligence applied in the right places can be extremely liberating. Where it's not liberating, of course, is the jobs that most people do. And I think a lot of the current concentration on future of work issues is because automation is now beginning to touch the middle class and the middle class's children. And they are now fearful about what is going to happen to their jobs. Nobody really cared when it was people in China or in Vietnam or Indonesia or indeed the working class of South Auckland. No one really cared about it at that point. Those jobs are still going to be there. They'll still be nasty, brutish and long, just like they always were. There may be a few less of them, there may be more pressure on them, they may be paid relatively less, but people will still be doing the drudge jobs. What we're looking at, I think, is a revolution that is going to affect that middle range of jobs, that should affect the top range of jobs, but probably won't. And the real issue that we face, to me, socially in the future of work, is the impact on people at the bottom who it's very hard to convince them they're going to be beneficiaries of the change, largely because they're not. And my view about that is, I won't go on any longer, but my view about that is that what we are going to have to do is to take away the link between the job you do and the income that you get for most people. We're going to have to see income as a social issue and jobs as an economic issue, because many of the jobs that people do simply will not be paying enough to maintain the social level of living that we expect to have. One last thing, if I can, then I will shut up. I love that Charles Darwin quote. It's certainly one of the possibilities about adaptability. The other great thinker that I apply in this is actually an Australian philosopher called Kerry Packer, who's dead now too. And Kerry used to have on his desk a little sign that said, I may get it a little wrong, but it basically said, the race doesn't always go to the swiftest. The strongest don't win every fight, but it pays to betters if they do. Now that wasn't actually Kerry's quote, he said it was, but he was Australian. So expect that. But what I think we have to remember is that in all these changes, where economic power lies, where political power lies, is going to determine where the benefits come. And so we can't make this a technology issue, it has to be a political issue. Fantastic. Kerry understood that.
Thank you. I think that kind of resonates with what Tony was saying earlier about making sure we focus on people. But also, I think what I'm hearing is we also need to be thinking about the people who don't have all the access to the economic power through this process. Diane, Tony talked about the Ports of Auckland's commitment to retrain people. Is that something that you'd recommend all businesses to do, or at least start to think about adopting the process that you've gone through, because it's absolutely multi-layered and multifaceted?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. The longer answer is, I think we get distracted by saying, is it a political issue? Is it a technology issue? Is it a people issue? I personally think it's around skills and capabilities. And I think there's one skill and capability that is a true paradigm shift that very few people have understood. And that is, and someone far more learned than me came up with this, but the new literacy of the 21st century is not reading and writing, it's the ability to unlearn. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're very good at saying, so we've got more to learn, we need to learn more than this, and we've got to add a new skill and add a new skill. But if you add those skills without unlearning the paradigms that you've been living with for the last 50 years, all of that is going to just be more of the same. And I think one of the challenges that we have with our whole ecosystem, the wider social ecosystem, is that all of the systems are set up for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Our political systems, our economic systems, our governance systems. And so as organisations, we can play in the space of preparing people for change, and that's really important. But I think, probably reflecting what Elizabeth said earlier, is you've got to attack it at a much more macro level. And at the micro level, you need to attack it at the level of, you've got to unlearn some of what you know. If you're going to restructure, you don't restructure by taking people from this department to that department. You look at whether you actually need management. You look at whether you actually need to have people working at certain times. You need to look at all of those fundamental things. And I think we just play around the edges. And while we do that, we're never going to change.
Wow. I love that, the idea that we need to unlearn things. And the image that was coming to me as you were speaking is the need for us to rebuild the plane while we're flying it, because everything's sort of happening at once and the whole macro system needs to change. So this is the audience's opportunity to ask these people with their great perspectives questions or comments if we've got them. We've got people joining us on live stream today, so they may also have questions for us if we're lucky. So who's got a good question or comment for the panel?
Sarah Holden, Oxygen Consulting. Francis, I was keen to know, can you give us any examples of countries that are doing the upskilling well?
No, the reality is I think we're all very new into this. We're in an early transition, and I think there are many pilots going on. Some large companies, AT&T is a good example, where they've done things like having their employees have shorter contracts and you have to reapply for your job. I think it's after every 4 years, is saying you need to constantly be committing to learning so you stay relevant. So I think there's some of those can be hard measures like that, where you're saying to people, actually there's an onus on the individual as well to say, how are you contributing to learning and to be able to contribute to our organisation? But I think overall, a lot of this we have to give ourselves at least some leeway that it was only 10 years ago that this all really started to happen. You know, it was the digitisation when we first got a smartphone that really enabled a lot of the transitions to happen, and the actual capacity now of processing technology. And so if you think back over the history of the world, there's never been such radical change in such a short period of time. And yet the power structures still sit with, you know, a lot of people who have great expertise in legacy world. So right now we're trying to sort of force a situation of bringing people into a digitised world while also allowing them to find space. And so I think we will be better at this in 5 years than we are today. And part of that will be as more and more millennials spill into the workplace. They're already the dominant 51% in New Zealand now, but then we've got another generation right behind who we're seeing big changes in the way what they want to learn, how they want to learn, how they want to work, who they want to work for. So suddenly if you're a large organisation, you can't find employees because your corporate structure has got no appeal to a whole generation, or the hierarchy that still exists in a world where it's become very flat. Then actually I think people are going to have to move very fast, or the profit they've had and the actual dividends they've been able to pay out will just disappear, and they'll start to understand as the new world evolves by the big population change that's coming.
Right. Thanks, Francis. Andrew, are you seeing anything from...
Yeah, look, I would say one of the big problems that we have had traditionally with reskilling and retraining, and I think it's on steroids in a future of work world, is that as it were, students, employees, the providers and employers have lived in these like 3 parallel universes where the overlap is minimal. So I think the systems that are working are those that have found a way to have real overlap, that the students are informed by jobs that actually exist, the providers have networks that shape that the curriculum is relevant. And I think the Germans and the Swiss and the Germans have sort of done that better than anyone historically. The Singaporeans are changing the game, and they're changing the game because of new contracts that are essentially risk sharing. So if I'm a provider, I now have an obligation to diagnose, again, this people centricity, to be really thoughtful about you and the skills that you have, to be honest around your prospects in the job, and actually to share risk with you. So in Singapore, let's say it costs you $30,000 to sign up for reskilling, retraining. If you don't get that job or that movement in, then you actually have a residual claim of 50% of that cost. Now, all of a sudden, that risk share, the incentives that happen, I'm not convincing you to do some airy-fairy job that doesn't exist. There's a real discipline around. So I'd say in general, countries that are finding a way. Francis mentioned AT&T. AT&T fundamentally did a micro version of that within the organisation. So I'd say overall, companies and countries that are finding a way to bring together those worlds. And I'd put the Swiss have always done it well. They're upgrading again. And I think Singapore is the one that's really sort of reinventing the game around just fundamentally the nature of how contracts and those arrangements get constructed.
Wow. I'm a bit optimistic in this area. If I could just share something with you. I spend a fair bit of time these days going around meetings like this, industry meetings or meetings of management particularly. It's mainly so they keep me out of the boardroom where I'm just a nuisance. But my observation is that at the level in our businesses of our HR departments and indeed a lot of operational management, there's a very good understanding of what's needed in respect to jobs and the change of jobs. The real problems are at the very senior management level and board level, where they are finding it very difficult to reconceptualise what the people working in their organisation should do and how they should do it. And I sense a real level of frustration amongst New Zealand managers at that middle level who can see and are dealing with the issues, are educating themselves a bit about the options, but there's a real problem at the senior leadership of New Zealand business in terms of this reconceptualising.
And have you got some recommendations for us about how we might tackle that?
Oh, well, we're going to have to change them because, you're not going to re-educate 50-year-old white men very easily. Just fact. We're not good at it. So we're going to have to change our managers in many instances. It's not all completely that way. I mean, there are some very good male managers, obviously, in New Zealand. We've got quite a good group of them too. So the issue may in fact be more at the board level, but I still think it's a senior management issue as well. But we're going to have an urgency about changing those people, and I would be much less concerned about rolling over people at other levels in the organisation than I would be about rolling over directors and senior managers and making them change more often than we do.
Wow, you heard it here first. Justine.
Thank you so much. I'm Justine Munro from the 21C Skills Lab. I'd like to raise a question to the group around the education system, particularly primary and secondary education, because it's there that our workers of the future, pretty near future, are being prepared, and it's their brains that are the most malleable and the most able to adopt things like growth mindsets and absorb the type of skills that are much harder to change when you're older. I think the New Zealand education system, while it's still okay on global terms with a whole lot of other issues, is not anywhere near moving fast enough, and I don't see any initiatives at a a government level that are going to change things fast enough. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the role of business in working much more positively and strategically with education system, and just in raising these ideas of other countries. We've been looking at some really strong examples going back for like 35 years of US, and this is just, there's obviously the Germans and the Swiss, but even in the US, things like business, schools, government partnerships on a regional basis, which have totally been focused on how to actually develop the skills that are needed. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on how New Zealand businesses can get much more focused on working with locally at education systems.
Thanks, Justine. Maybe
Can I add just something interesting around the education? So Sir Peter Gluckman, if he was here, is part of, there are 35 countries that have chief scientists like New Zealand does. There's a network called INGSA, which is that global network. They've just commissioned some research, because exactly as you say, Justine, the future of work very quickly becomes the future of education. Mm-hmm. The really surprising thing they've found, if you look at the human attributes that are most likely to be needed to succeed in the future of work world, 80-90% of them get locked in the first 1,000 days of life. So I think the other thing, just to add to your point, it's not just primary and secondary school, it's actually those first 1,000 days where I think we're even probably more absent from the conversation around the role that needs to be played. So that's what I completely agree, but we can't, that first 1,000 days is actually going to be the main game when we think about the world going forward.
Probably speaks to the real challenge is not just for business, but it is for government, because of course the same people who populate businesses that some of whom Rob has described, populate government as well. And that is going to take a fundamental mind shift, because businesses will continue to do what they do, and that is develop and grow and change as their markets change. The ability for governments to do this at pace is very limited. And the governments that can do it quickly, and ours could be one, can win in this environment. And I think, though, we are still far too slow to react to some of the big shifts that we've seen. We haven't had a sufficient evidence base, which is what McKinsey are now providing, particularly in the future workspace. And I think it'll be culturally there'll be some significant challenges within educational institutions to try and get them to move fast enough and to think and adapt and change in different ways. And that'll be complicated for people. It'll be challenging. It'll be as challenging for those people as for the people who Tony has had to work through some change. So it will take a long period of time, but we need it to happen fast.
I think business can be proactive. I know that I've gone out to some schools and actually spoken to the teachers. And I think one of the challenges we have in the schools is that many of the teachers we have in our schools have never worked in a job other than teaching. And they've come through an education system that is 25 years out of date, or maybe 50 years out of date. And I say that as an ex-teacher. But I think that it's okay if businesses have got people that they can go and actually build those one-on-one relationships. If you can get into the board of trustees and just say, I'd love to come down and talk to your teachers about what we're doing in our work. And it's both a boost for your own company if you're because they love to build relationships with the company, but it's also a chance to say, our business is probably not what you thought it was. And for us at the port, that's very clear, because a lot of people don't understand. They think that ports are just about putting boxes on and off ships. They don't realise the extent of what we're doing and what the innovation is. And when you go out and talk to teachers about this, you can see the ahas happening. And because if you don't have the right teachers in place, it doesn't really matter what else is going on. It's not going to work.
I think there's still a tendency in business in New Zealand, and there are some obvious exceptions, but there's still a tendency in business in New Zealand to look to the educational organisations as if, and tell them, and I've heard it said, we are not getting enough job-ready people coming out of the schools and tertiary institutions. And really the issue is, are you ready for the people who are coming out of the schools and tertiary institutions? The job of those organisations is not to produce people who are fully employment ready for today's job, or worse, yesterday's job. So I think that what that tells you is that business is going to have to learn that it has to adapt to the generation that is coming through and is going to be employed in the future. It's got to think about the jobs that we're providing, because I actually think the generation coming out of our schools and tertiary institutions is really well educated and really capable and really driven, and what they meet in the workplace is something that's not ready to meet them. And so I think it's more of an internal thing for businesses than something we have to tell the educational institutions they should be doing.
If I could just add a little bit to that as well, I think that we need to be really mindful that we need to augment education. We need the people who are coming through formal programs and qualifications. We need people who are self-taught. And there are a lot of amazing talent coming through who are self-taught now and self-educated, plus the entrepreneurs and the technologists and the tradespeople. At the moment, I'd put the challenge back to parents and also to employers, because to your point, Rob, if they're coming through and they don't look like the person you hired for the last 10 years and don't have the same piece of paper as the people you had last 10 years, then what's the chance that that employer is going to look at them? And I always use this example of a stagnant pond. If you just put lots of the same people in a room and you have no theropod in a stream, it goes green. We're putting a lot of people with the same skill sets into a room and looking for more just like that. But then it comes back to a parent, because the parents are not standing up necessarily to the education system saying, why are we doing it the same way, and still want them to go through a more traditional pathway. So a young person who wants to be self-taught or become an entrepreneur is still not necessarily seen as a safe gig. So we have to also take some ownership of that as well, I think, as parents and employers.
So go ahead to Kirk first.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andrew said something about it as well. Our system is still quite siloed, and I said my opening remarks that the workplace needs to play a much greater role in education, and that is before people get into the workplace. That is, to your point, Rob, really about young people having the opportunity to engage in learning which is outside the school environment at their own pace. So, and that can be also very challenging for employers, and it's been done pretty poorly in New Zealand. There are much better examples of where workplace learning is integrated as a much broader part of your workplace education. Switzerland is one of those.
And a final
I think one really interesting way to think about it, look, I don't have a Kerry Packer quote on this, but in terms of, Bill Gates, probably no one has spent more private money trying to reform education than Bill Gates. And Bill Gates said, listen, he basically failed trying to reform the overall system. He gives this analogy now saying, listen, he believes education is becoming like the music business. So you think when we grew up, there was always a dominant format for music. It was the LP that became the cassette tape, that then became the DVD, the CD, etc. And you look at today, there are, I think, about 30 different ways, platforms that we consume music. But the live product has now become actually where all the money and such like is really made. He has the same view with education. He said, listen, trying just to reform the one thing is just not going to work. But what he's trying to nourish is essentially an ecosystem that becomes more like the music business, where you have many different platforms that end up being the sort of ecosystem that provide. And I do look at South Korea is not perfect but in one of the really interesting things, there are now a dozen teachers earning more than $3 million in South Korea, because they've become the online stars of education. And in South Korea, literally your average student consumes education through 4 or 5 different channels. Still, they have the original one, but they're getting these dramatically different outcomes because of this richness of this. And by the way, private enterprise is playing, rather than trying to just run schools, they're actually playing much more of a relevant role around some of these different platforms and curated channels and mentors. And my own view is that's more the pathway, rather than us trying to sort of take over schools. I think that multi-channel approach, I think, is the way of the future for how, because I'm with you, I think we're not where we need to be, and the world is coming in a hurry, and this precious human talent that we have, I think we could do a much, much better job in terms of how we prepare it.
Wow, I like that. The idea that this could be, we could draw an analogy with music that makes it feel a lot more optimistic. Thank you very much to the panel. That was really a really rich conversation, and there was a lot I learnt from that, and I feel like I've been talking to Rob about the future of work now for about 2 years. what we are hearing, and I think it's kind of not been touched on directly, but this kind of need for the silos to not be so siloed, that we need to start building bridges between education and businesses and schools and boards and whoever. So what we're getting fairly strong feedback from our members around is a desire to collaborate. What's not clear is what businesses and other organisations would like to collaborate around. So we're exploring that at the moment. Those of you who've got that desire or starting to wonder about what it is you could get together with other businesses or other organisations on to work on in this space, please come and talk to me or Rob, who leads this particular piece of work. What we're also doing today is we have done a thought piece around the future of work. It's really a primer for businesses who are trying to get their heads around this. A lot of the trends and unpacking the things we're learning. It's got some of McKinsey's great research in it, but some other material we've picked up from speaking to members and from other businesses and globally. That's launched today and that's on our website. So if you're interested in that, just Google Future of Work when you go to the Sustainable Business Council website. Our next event, for those of you who are here with your executive and director hats on, will be around climate risk, which is going to be one of the other major forces which shapes boardrooms if it isn't already. So we live in a world of really challenging, intersecting trends, and how our executives and directors think about climate risk is a pretty significant one for us. So that will be in late May or June for those of you who are interested. And then in October, we'll be celebrating our first anniversary of launching our Good Governance Guidance, which we obviously did last October because it's the anniversary. And we're really keen to see how businesses have progressed using that, because that was really about helping our businesses embed sustainability and think about it from a governance point of view. So if any of you have been using that framework that we launched at that point, please let us know. We'd love to share some case studies. So thank you to our participants, thank you audience, thank you those of you who are on live stream and didn't get to experience the torrential Auckland rain today. Thank you AT for hosting us, and for those who want to stay, please do, and those who need to go, thank you and have a good day. Haere rā.